All right, thank you. Hi, my name is Marco. If you haven't met, please reach out afterwards. I'm a full stack developer and open source contributor and super happy to be here and super excited to see this conference happening, and thanks to Becky and Spike for having us here. Today I want to talk about developer tooling and how it affects the modern Rails and Hotwire era. And we want to talk about LSPs, language servers. We want to understand them, we want to build a simple one, and then kind of show what's next in the tooling space. I've been on the core team for the Stimulus Reflex and Cable Ready gems for the past 5 years or so, and I've been maintaining Stimulus over the past 3 years as well. I love open source, and if you can tell from this slide, I have been doing a bunch of stuff in in the Hotwire space, in Turbo and Stimulus. It's kind of a passion at this point, so it's really cool to see that evolving and kind of happening as we speak. I started to actively contribute back in 2019, and at the time I was working at a shop that was doing React and Rails API. And I don't mind React, I like React, but the way how people build apps with React is sometimes a little bit too much. And I felt like I had enough. I wanted to go back to Ruby, back to Rails where I'm home. And I want to keep building Rails and Hotwire app because it feels like you have a superpower. That's kind of, you're the most productive with it. And I personally believe it's also the future of modern Rails apps in general. I want to do full stack apps again. I want to build all the stuff by myself, single stack, single person. That's what we kind of call it, the single engineer framework. And for that to happen, I want to help build the modern tooling that's missing for enabling that. Which is why I went open source full-time for a little bit over a year back in 2022 to work on Hotwire and related projects just because I had fun doing so. But I also noticed that while I was working in React, that their tooling, and especially the JavaScript tooling in general, the developer experience is really awesome. And we didn't really have something like this in the Ruby world, I think. Or if there was something, it wasn't quite as easy to set up and get started with. We had Solograph for the longest time. It's a great project, it's really good. But I had my trouble setting it up and it was never really as easy to get started with. So I started to miss these tools I knew from React and the JavaScript worlds, and I wanted to have them in my daily work in Ruby and Rails too. And I'm the kind of person who doesn't use an IDE. To me, they always felt clunky, heavyweights, cumbersome to use, and somehow made me less productive in a way. I don't know why. But in the past few years, stuff changed, and we kind of got the other evolution, if you will. We got the language service protocol, LSP for short. So what is it, and why do we want to use it? It's a way of providing language intelligence without the need for having to install an IDE specifically for this framework or language. And before we had LSPs, if you wanted to build, for example, a Ruby plugin, you would have to build a plugin for all the editors you want to support. But with the language server protocol, you get to write one server, one language server, and all the editors that speak that protocol can just use it and make use of that intelligence for free, pretty much. So how does it work? You have kind of a mapping in your editor that kind of registers all the available servers. And whenever you open a file of that specific kinds, the editor will start a background process, a language server, and will try to respond to these requests. It usually communicates over standard in, standard out, but there are also options to do it over TCP/IP. It uses JSON RPC under hoods. If you aren't familiar with this, it's kind of like HTTP in the sense that you also have a header up top, and you have a body. In this case, it's a blob of JSON. So this leads us to Stimulus LSP, and the question is, what are we trying to solve here? So if you aren't familiar with Stimulus, this is the basic example they have on the website. And what we care about here is these attributes, which are the controllers, the targets, the action, and so on. And if you aren't familiar with the syntax, it's kind of hard to remember all the syntax, how you write it, what you have to use, and where you have to reference the right names. So what we want to do is we kind of want to provide you help with making it right or getting it right. So you want to have a list of all the available attributes. And when you select one of those, you want to get all the values that are kind of valid or good for this attribute. And when you kind of autocomplete this, you might end up with something like this. But if you have been using Stimulus, you might have noticed that there is a typo here. It should be an underscore, not a dash. And that's just super hard to miss. And it happened to me a bunch of times. I've been wasting a lot of hours with that, and it happens so easily. I think if you have been using it, you probably experienced it yourself too. So that was kind of the initial thought of, right, like, we can do better than that. So a few years back in 2021, I was looking up and said, yeah, what do we have to do to make this work? So I looked it up. I found this really good extension guide on the VS Code docs. And they reference this repo. It had a bunch of examples in it. And they had one specific one for LSPs. And this basic one had this simple autocomplete. It just gives you two options for text documents. So let's see how this one specifically works. So when you are in your editor, you have the cursor that points. It will send a request, in this case, a text document completion request. It sends along some attributes with it, like the file you are in and the position your cursor is right now. And the server can respond, do anything, and respond with a JSON response in the end. It has a certain format. In this case, it's just a JSON blob, and it's a list, and it has a few attributes in it. And with getting that back to the editor, it will render something like this in VS Code, and you got this autocomplete for free. So with that, we kind of have the basic idea of what we want to do. But how does it translate now to our HTML use case? Stimulus doesn't have any grammar or any like syntax specifically. It's all HTML attributes. But an HTML LSP wouldn't know about these stimulus attributes. So we are dealing with what we call embedded languages. The stimulus grammar is not part of the HTML spec, so it doesn't know about it. So we need to have a way of kind of extending the HTML syntax or the HTML grammar to handle stimulus as well. And we can do this with language services, which also leads us to the next question: what language do you write this service in? There are a few choices here. Some of you might like some of these languages, some of you don't. Preferably it would be Ruby, but we ended up using TypeScript because of a few reasons. People have been using Hotwire in different frameworks in different languages, and it felt always wrong to kind of require Ruby to be set up and available on the system, even if you just want to have tooling in your editor. So the portability aspect, the existing data providers, the existing language services, and all the integration around it kind of made it an obvious choice for our case. And with that, they provide a language service for HTML already, which we can use. And what we have to do is we have to write one single data provider, which is a class that we can extend from. And by implementing these methods, it automatically knows about all our syntax automatically. So let's implement this. We have a provide tags method, and since we are extending the HTML grammar, we can add new tags to it too. But since we're using stimulus, we don't have extra tags. We're just using regular attributes. So for this, we just return an empty array and are done with that. Next up are the attributes. We get passed in a tag too, but since you can put HTML stimulus controls on any tag, we don't really care about that. What we want to do is we kind of return this list, and there are a few static ones we can talk about and some dynamic ones we can look at later. So for the static ones, we can just return another array with a list of these attributes. And for the other ones, we need to know about our application and our controls that we have in our application, so we can interpolate these values. So we need to parse the JavaScript, or we need to parse our stimulus controls for us to be able to do that. So let's put up a class in JavaScript, which is a controller definition, where we just hold a reference to all these controls we have in our app. It has a path, it has methods, targets, and everything else you can do with stimulus. And we're using Acorn to parse our JavaScript. We write a little class, a parser class. It has a parse controller method, takes in the code, the source code, and the file name. And then if you look at this example where we have a hello controller, which user generates with Rails new, you get targets, you get methods, and what we care about is these parts here, the targets and the methods that we want to parse out. So we can write a little script, a glob pattern to look for all the controls in our app, loop over them, read the file, and then pass them into our controller, our parse controller function. In there, we can parse it using Acorn. We get a abstract syntax tree, and then we can walk down this a representation of our source code and look for method definitions. And whenever we find one of those, we push that name into our methods array. And with that, we can kind of parse all the basic information about a single controller. We can do something very similar for targets, and then this controller turns into an instance of this control definition class, which looks like this, where we have the path, the methods, the targets, and so on. And with this information, we can then go and try to interpolate these values now, because we have the controllers, we have our targets, so everything we need to finish that. This is where we left off, the static ones, and now we can add a new ones on top. We loop over all our, or map over all our controllers, interpolate the names, we get a list of target attributes, we spread them back into our array that we return, and with that, we have the basic idea of autocomplete for targets. And when you look in our editor now, we get an experience like this, where you have the actions, the controllers, but also now specifically the data held targets, which is what we had in our controller. So this is already quite useful. Now, if you autocomplete, for example, the controller attribute, you would want to know which values are allowed here, which are actually valid here. And that's what we get to do in our last method, which is to provide values. We get a tag again, which you don't care about, and we get our attributes, so we know which ones we are completing for. And here we can check if we are dealing with the data controller attribute, and if we do, we just return a list of all the identifiers we know about. And if it doesn't match, we can check if it matches the target attributes. And if it does, we find the right controller and then return all the targets we know about. And with this, we get something like this, where you have the controllers, you get all the possible values for the identifiers. And if you specify a target, you get all the valid targets in the controller. That was kind of the first initial commit I did in like a night's worth of hacking. So it was kind of fun. And then a few days later, I messaged a friend of mine to just showcase this to him and just send a demo. And he was like pretty impressed by it and was like, yeah, we should continue working on this. So that's what we did. So what else can we do? The thing is, when you might be thinking, can AI do all of that now? And probably, maybe. But I think there are a few different use cases where it doesn't make sense. So I feel like AI is really good for boilerplate, for generating a lot of markup. But LSPs are really good for making sure the stuff is accurate and that actually is what you actually want. With AI, you have still a limited context window, and you have a lot of files that you have to know about. And the AI is not really good with making the connections between these files. When you have the controller files, the view files, partials, it doesn't get that right most of the times. But even if it would do it, get it right, we still have diagnostics, which makes it really useful. So when the AI generates some codes, the LSP can tell you if the code it generated was right. And that's still, I think, a useful use case. And most of this is inspired by Ruby's did you mean suggestions as well. When you misspell a typo, a method name, it will give you some suggestions of what you could have meant. So similarly, we do this now in Stimulus with the LSP. When you have an underscore somewhere, it will give you a suggestion of what you could have meant. That works for controllers, works for actions, works for targets, and even for the values if you pass the wrong type. So that's already quite cool, but can we do more? So we already know that something is wrong about the code. We know what it could have meant. So can we provide code actions to help you guide in the right direction? So what you can do now as well is if you have a wrong controller, you can have the quick fix actions and then replace that suggestion in your view with the new value that they could have meant. And with all of these features kind of ready, we kind of fast forward to October last year, where I kind of felt confident enough to release this to the public. And that's what we did. And thanks to the language server protocol, we could also support of all of these editors out of the box without doing any more work, which is quite cool. But then we asked the community for feedback to get like how they are using it and how they might be having issues with it. So we got a lot of ideas, feedback, and I started to notice that a lot of the naive approaches they were using was falling short, yeah. So especially around the way we were parsing our JavaScript with Acorn didn't quite work the way we wanted to. because there's a lot of different syntax in JavaScript and a lot of different versions with the ES versions. You might have known it's quite a mess, but we got it figured out. The other problem was not all apps are using app JavaScript controllers, and we kind of hard-coded that. Turns out not all apps use this, so that works now too. And the way you can register or install stimulus in the application is really huge. There's a lot of ways to do it. And if you have been using Rails front in the last few years, you might have seen some of these tools here. And if you want to provide a tool, you kind of have to support all of those to make it work in all apps. So that took quite a lot of time to make that work in all of these scenarios. And most times you just had a situation where it technically works, but you just produce a lot of false positives and inaccurate results, which is really annoying for you as a user because you want it to be reliable. So we addressed all these issues. We technically rewrote the whole parser to make up for that. And this is what powered the new release that we released earlier this May. So we could extract the parser. We could use that to ship this LSP 1.0 release, which adds support for controls from npm packages, for TypeScript files, for more code actions, and a lot of more things. So that was really a success. And then next up, we also got recently support in RubyMine, a major editor in the Ruby world, to support it out of the box, which is cool. And then all of these diagnostics we talked about earlier are not specifically tied to the LSP itself. So we could kind of extract those two and make them so you can use them independently. Kind of like you use Rubocop. You can use Rubocop as a standalone tool, but your editor might warn you about warnings as well. And that's what we kind of want to do here too. We want to provide a stimulus lint package so we get all the errors, diagnostics, best practices, and so on in like a single handy CLI. So you can run this locally or on CI before you ship to production and kind of test that your controls are actually valid and do the right thing. And the other problem we have right now is that we don't support all the HTML ERB syntax. So if you're interpolating using the data hash, it doesn't quite work yet. So we have to fix that. And then also provides diagnostics code actions for ERB tooling too. And this is what leads us to the triple LSP as well. It's already available now, but it's really super basic. And it has the same issue here because Turbo makes heavy use of all the view helpers in ERB. So for it to be actually useful, we have to provide intelligence for ERB. We have to understand ERB. And right now, there's not really a good solution to parse and understand ERB with HTML. So the LSP understands HTML and ERB documents, but it doesn't understand when you use Ruby to output HTML. And that was the kind of big issue that we have here. I gave a talk at Rails World last year where we had this kind of point up there to say that we want to support Turbo LSP if the Ruby LSP supports it. And this led to discussion with Vinny, the creator of the Ruby LSP. And we ended up trying to make it work in Ruby LSP. And last year at RubyConf Hack Day, we got together to work on this. And we also started to realize that if we want to go beyond the basics, we need to have something more powerful. So the approach we ended up using for that was that we have this document here. And what we would do is we strip out all the HTML around it. And when you do this, you are just left with the Ruby codes. And then you can use any Ruby parser to make that work. And then you can understand the file. This is also what shipped a few weeks ago with Ruby LSP now. So this is quite cool. And they have been shipping a lot of features as well alongside that. So if you haven't been using Ruby LSP, check out this article to see what it can do for you today. But back to this problem here. When we kind of did this whole thing, we lost the whole HTML context in the process. And it really matters where you are interpolating in a HTML document. If you are interpolating in between tags, in values, or just at the top level, it has a different meaning, right? So we want to kind of support HTML with embedded Ruby, as you would use in HTML ERB files. But ERB itself is super versatile, so you can use it for pretty much anything when you're interpolating Ruby. So you could use it for interpolating emails or for text documents or anything else, right? So what we really need is a HTML-aware ERB parser, and that's kind of what I've been trying to get at the last few months. to make that work and see what's possible by doing so. For my big inspirations here to kind of power these tools that we have been talking about. And what you have to understand is that we want to parse these scenarios where you're using Rails tags helpers, if you're using content tags, if you're using loops, if you're using for each, if you're using conditionals, if you're using data controls, data attributes. Which made me think there's something missing in the HTML abstraction, because in the end, what we want to see as a output, we want to kind of treat those two things equally, because in the end, it just outputs the same thing. Similarly, we want to treat these two equally, but that's not something you can easily do today. So this needs a lot of more exploration to see where this can go. But if this is done right, you could also maybe support Haml, Slim, and other languages to get this in the same format to then provide the same tools for all of these out of the box. And if this is also done right, we might be able to extend or provide some more language services in general, like we were using the HTML language service earlier. So if you have this and we understand all of that, and if you understand even Rails render calls, we could provide even more advanced diagnostics. For example, if you have this controller here, or this snippet, the target in here has to be inside the controller elements. So this target needs to be inside of this element. If this is outside, it doesn't quite work. It does just nothing. It doesn't tell you anything about it. And I guess realistically speaking, modern Rails apps are not one file. They are split up between partials, views, components, and so on. So you might have rendering this partial from another file, and then it gets really tricky to understand how these files relate to each other and how we can kind of provide diagnostics. But if you can get the parts to understand this and kind of build up a tree of all your files and all your views, you might be able to just reference these different tools and make tooling on top of that. So when we kind of render the partial outside of these elements, we could also try to annotate this and saying, this is actually not in the right place. I've lost so many hours debugging stuff like that. It's really, this would be really helpful. So that's what I've been trying to get at, just trying to see if we can make this work and power these tools. But also by doing some research, I found a lot of other gems that are dealing with similar situations. So maybe it could even be helpful for them to have something like that available. Maybe even a formatter that works out of the box for free. That's just like you install it and it works. I have been trying to get this working in my environment. Couldn't make it work. A linter that kind of tries to figure stuff out for you. Or possibly even a new ERB engine that kind of understands all of that out of the box. We'll see. The Ruby parser, the Prism that had been released like last year, had a big effect on Ruby internals and the tooling landscape, but it can do stuff with Ruby. It actually just shipped today in the Ruby 3.4 preview 2 as a default parser, which is kind of cool. And I feel like something like this for HTML could also improve the landscape in general for templated languages, which is kind of the goal of this whole journey. Okay, I have one more thing. I have been working with a friend of mine on a Hotwire browser extension. This came all about from this tweet by Matt Swanson a few years back. He was using a CSS hack to annotate the turbo frames, so kind of outline them so you can see where the frames are. And I was talking with my friend Leon about this, and he then just spun up a new project as well. So Hotwire DevTools is available today too. It works in all major browsers, and it gives you this little panel here for disabling all the features it has. And one cool thing I noticed is on Stack Overflow, if you have this enabled, here you can see all the outlined elements that are stimulus controls on the page. So most of the interactions in Stack Overflow are powered by stimulus, which I found surprising. And in the bottom right corner, you can see all the controls that are referenced and used on this page. I have a sneak peek here too. And while working on this extension, we also found GitHub is using a bunch of turbo frames all over the place. So we've been trying to see if we can visualize how buttons and frames kind of relate to each other, so you have a visual representation of that. But as you can see on this slide here, it gets a little bit messy quickly, so we have to figure out a way of how we can make this more readable. And then in the Stimulus Refix ecosystem, we had this plugin that was kind of highlighting you which buttons are interactive, which view files it would render, which parts of the page it would update if you click on this button, and all of that kind of with these boxes alongside. So if you can bring this to Turbo as well, which is what we're trying to do, that would be really cool to debug Turbo applications. Another thing is that if you have been using Turbo streams, you might have noticed that they are super quick to execute. And sometimes if there are a bunch of them at the same time, it's hard to see what's happening. So we want to kind of bring a debug bar to that so you can stop the execution, step through them, and see what's actually going on. A similar thing with turbo frames. You can get this button here to reload this current frame, request the page, and then get updates. And there are a lot of more ideas on the roadmap. It's all a work in progress. So if you have any ideas on how you could make this your life easier with daily Hotwire work, let me know. We can see if we can make it work. Okay, so to conclude, I think developer experience and developer economics matter. I think we have been somehow missing these tools in the last few years in Ruby and Rails land. And I feel like there's so much more potential to level up. We are just catching up now. But as I was working on these tools, I feel like you have a super exciting future with them. And that's kind of why I'm doing all of that. And then at the same time, I think it's also why language stays relevant if you have tools and the tooling around it. Or if you kind of put it the other way around, it's kind of expected today that frameworks and languages have these tools available. Otherwise, people are just not picking them up. Especially the newcomers I kind of had to work with. They have been struggling to just understand why Ruby doesn't provide you any intelligent tooling. So it's really, I think, crucial for the new generation to have these tools available. And yeah, we have been lagging behind. And because of that, I want to keep building that. And I want to keep building Rails and Hotwire applications. I want to keep using Ruby and Rails. And that's why I'm trying to help build these tools for the future of Rails applications. One more thing here, I have been running a Hotwire weekly newsletter, which is a weekly roundup of what's happening in the world of Hotwire. So if you are interested in keeping up what's happening, you can sign up on the socials here or on hotwireweekly.com. It comes out every Sunday. So I'm just trying to stand in for a more productive Hotwire ecosystem, for a more unified Hotwire ecosystem. And I want to be available to talk about that with you. So if you have any feedbacks, ideas, thoughts, questions, come see me after the talk. And if you are into stickers, I got some of these too. So that's all I have. Thank you. The question was how I'm interacting with my LSP. I don't. I've been using it to test my LSP, but I have been mostly using still Atom, which is what I'm transitioning from, to NeoVim. But in NeoVim, I'm using the LSPs too. Yeah. But it's easy to deal with on test in VS Code with all the debugging tools around it. Yeah. The question was how many days it takes to ship ERB LSP support. I don't know. Hopefully soon, but I feel like it's a bigger effort that we have to go through first. And I want to do it right, and I think that takes more time now. But I hope to see something in the next few months. Yeah. No promises though. The question was if I know something about LSPs now that I wish I knew earlier. I think just that I'm not that scary that you think. It's just like you write a Rails application, you have a client and a server, and it's really just the same interaction. So if it's anything like maybe I could show here in this talk, I think it's just easier than you think to make it work. Yeah. Cool. Thank you.